Hello and welcome to Topic Lake Insights presents Regulation Rangers, making sense of rules that shape our world.
Exactly.
I'm Julian Cross.
And I'm Elena Harper.
I'm the host, and Lena's our regulatory expert for today's show. We're going to be taking a look at all the new regulations that dropped on January 10th.
Yeah. It's a lot, actually.
It really is.
Yeah.
There's a ton of them. Looks like a pretty diverse batch, too. Everything from wildlife to wine, and even some hydrogen thrown in for good measure.
It is a real grab bag, but I think that's kind of what makes it interesting, right? We get to take a peek into all these different corners of the regulatory world and see what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree.
Yeah.
It's always interesting to see what they come up with. So, all right, let's unpack this. First up, the Department of Agriculture.
Okay.
They've made some changes to their Privacy Act regulations. Anything stand out to you there?
Well, what I think is really fascinating here is that they've exempted a specific system of records. It's called SNICAS.
SNICAS.
Yes. That stands for the Smuggling, Interdiction, and Trade Compliance National Information Communication Activity System, USDA HAFIS 21, if you want to get technical.
Catchy.
Yeah, they've exempted it from certain Privacy Act provisions. And this system deals with how the USDA handles data related to smuggling and trade compliance.
So maybe a little less privacy when it comes to stopping those smuggled avocados.
Right, exactly.
But in the grand scheme of things, I mean, what does this really mean?
Well, I think it could signal a shift in priorities, maybe a move towards prioritizing security and enforcement in agricultural trade, even potentially at the expense of individual privacy in some cases.
Oh, interesting.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially for businesses involved in importing or exporting agricultural products. I would say if you're in that boat, you might want to double check your data security practices just to be safe.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, it never hurts to be extra careful, especially when regulations are changing. All right, let's move on to something a little more palatable. How about some adult beverages? The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB as they're commonly known,
Okay.
they're shaking things up with some new rules for wine and distilled spirits containers.
They are, yeah. They're adding a whole bunch of new standard sizes. 13 for wine and 15 for distilled spirits. Plus, they're getting rid of the separate size rules for canned spirits.
So what does this all mean for the average person browsing the liquor store aisle?
Well, think about it this way. More sizes, more choices.
Okay.
Right. Imagine you're at the store and you're looking for a specific type of wine, say a Pinot Noir. Now you might have even more options in terms of bottle sizes and price points. You could maybe get a smaller bottle for a casual weeknight dinner. Or if you've got people coming over, you can grab a larger format for a party.
Yeah.
It gives consumers and producers more flexibility.
Yeah, I could definitely raise a glass to that.
Yeah.
Okay, now on to something a bit more dry. The Comptroller of the Currency, or OCC. They've announced adjustments to their monetary penalties for 2025. What's going on there?
This one's pretty routine, actually.
Okay.
Each year, the OCC, along with a lot of other agencies, adjusts its civil money penalties based on inflation, just to keep those penalties in line with the changing value of the dollar.
Yeah, makes sense. So nothing too dramatic there, just keeping up with the times.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next up, the Department of Education. Always a hotbed of regulatory activity. What's happening on that front?
Well, they're proposing some pretty interesting changes to the Randolph-Sheppard Act regulations, specifically around definitions. The goal is to clarify some of the existing language and make sure the program is really equipped for the 21st century.
Now, the Randolph-Sheppard Act, for those who might not be familiar, can you give us a little rundown of what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a program that helps blind and visually impaired individuals operate vending facilities on federal property. So like courthouses, post offices, that kind of thing. Think of those little snack stands you often see in government buildings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So these changes are basically trying to modernize that program.
Exactly. They're looking at how technology has changed vending, how customer demands have evolved, and trying to make sure the program is still effective in today's world.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Here's where things get really interesting, at least for me. The Department of the Interior, specifically the Fish and Wildlife Service, has issued not one but two rules about salamanders.
Salamanders, yes.
Salamanders.
And it's actually pretty important. Believe it or not, this is all about protecting U.S. ecosystems from a deadly fungus called chytrid fungus, which some salamanders can carry.
Oh, wow. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is trying to stop the spread of this fungus by regulating salamanders.
Precisely. They already added 20 genera of salamanders to the list of injurious amphibians back in 2016, and now they're adding 16 more and clarifying some of the rules. It's a big step toward preventing further ecological damage.
Wow, salamanders causing international incidents. Who knew?
Right.
Okay, next up we have another division within the Department of Interior, the Natural Resources Revenue Office.
The ONR.
ONR.
Yes.
They're also making those inflation adjustments to civil monetary penalties,
Wow.
just like we saw with the OCC.
Exactly. It's standard practice across many agencies, just making sure those penalties have the same bite in 2025 as they did before.
Okay, so keeping those penalties biting in 2025. On to the Department of Labor. What's on their agenda?
Well, they've issued a final rule adjusting their own civil monetary penalties for inflation, following in the footsteps of the OCC and ONRR. This is all part of making sure the impact of those penalties stays consistent over time.
Makes sense. Another inflation adjustment, another agency checking off that box. What about the Department of State? Anything exciting happening there?
Well, they're also adjusting their civil monetary penalties based on December 2024 guidance from the Office of Management and Budget and recent legislation.
Okay.
They haven't forgotten about inflation either.
So the State Department is jumping on that bandwagon too. Now, let's shift gears and head over to the Department of Transportation, DOT. They've always got a lot going on, especially with all their different sub-agencies, starting with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, or, FMCSA for short. What's new with them?
So the FMCSA has issued a final rule correcting some previous amendments to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. It's essentially a cleanup effort to make sure everything is accurate and clear within those regulations.
So like fine-tuning the rule book for truck drivers and trucking companies.
Exactly, keeping those roads safe.
All right. Sticking with the DOT, how about the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation?
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, quite a mouthful. What are they up to?
The SLSDC, as they're thankfully known, is updating their seaway regulations and rules. They're clarifying a lot of existing requirements across different categories, things like lockage procedures, vessel traffic management, that kind of thing.
So streamlining things for everyone sailing the Great Lakes. Speaking of transportation, what's the latest from the Federal Aviation Administration? Always important to know what's happening in the skies.
Well, the FAA has issued a new airworthiness directive for certain Boeing 757 airplanes. This one requires installing new relays and changing some wire bundles related to the power transfer unit control valve.
Oh.
Yeah, there have been some reports of these valves failing to open when commanded, so this is all about enhancing safety and preventing potential issues.
Yeah, definitely a good thing for anyone who prefers their flights without unexpected dips and dives.
For sure.
All right. What's happening over at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA?
So they've issued a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking that would change how automakers notify people about recalls.
Okay.
Right now, it's mostly through snail mail, but they're proposing to add electronic notifications like emails and text messages.
Well, that's interesting. Seems like a much faster and more efficient way to get the word out, especially in our digital age. I mean, who even checks their physical mailbox these days?
I know, right?
Okay. Moving on to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. Always a big player in the regulatory game. What's their latest move?
Well, they're actually withdrawing a proposed rule. It would establish federal baseline water quality standards for Indian reservations.
Oh.
It seems they're shifting gears and focusing more on collaborating with tribes to support their own water quality programs.
So empowering tribes to manage their own resources.
Exactly. It's a good step towards self-determination, I think.
I agree. What about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission? What are they focused on?
They've released a final rule regarding record-keeping and reporting requirements under a whole bunch of acts, Title VII, the ADA, GNA, and the PWFA. This is all about making sure employers are keeping the right records and reporting data related to things like workplace discrimination and harassment.
So it sounds like a lot of paperwork, but also a really important step in protecting employee rights.
Definitely.
All right, 2 more to go. Let's tackle the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. What's on their radar?
They've issued a final rule called the Rule on Unfair or Deceptive Fees. It's aimed at cracking down on all those sneaky fees and charges for things like live event tickets and short-term lodging, those hidden costs that always seem to pop up at the last minute.
Oh, yeah. I know those all too well.
Like when you're trying to book a flight and then by the time you add all the fees, you're paying double the original price. It's ridiculous.
Oh, it's the worst.
Yeah. So this rule is about protecting consumers from those shady practices.
Yeah. Definitely a win for consumers.
Absolutely.
Okay. Last but not least, we have the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS. What's new in the world of taxes?
Well, they've issued a final rule implementing the credit for production of clean hydrogen and certain energy credit provisions. This is all part of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 and aims to encourage investment in clean energy technologies.
So tax breaks for going green. Interesting.
Yeah.
What about the Treasury Department as a whole? Anything noteworthy from them?
They've actually teamed up with the IRS to release a rule regarding the reissuance of state or local bonds. It's about providing clarity and guidance for these transactions, ensuring everything runs smoothly and complies with regulations.
That's quite a roundup of regulations. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
It's always a pleasure to dive into the latest rules and figure out what they mean for all of us.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And for those of you who want to explore these regulations in more detail, visit www.topiclake.com to stay up to date.